good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, wherever you're tuning in. I'm so glad to see your smiling faces. You're smiling, right? All right, welcome. I am Ryan O, your host of the Controversial Exchange. Before we jump into who is on the show, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the first week, all the supporters out there. It is amazing to see those sort of comments, DMs, everything flowing in. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You all make this worth all of the effort that goes into this show. Now, today, we want to talk about things kind of in this progressive format and that are tougher, essentially. So, episode 1 set the context for why this podcast, who we are. Episode 2 is with a very special guest, Rick Kubina. Now, Rick, I'm going to link all his information down in the show notes. You can go learn about him. He is very, 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 very passionate about standardization. And when it comes to behavioral science, it's very important that you have certain standards. Now, these standards can cause problems. We're going to talk about, the rigidity that may come into these having certain standards, but the benefits that can come from them as well. So part of this podcast is it's sort of an op-ed, just discussion style, going to see where it goes. Now, you'll see in this episode that we had just that happen. I was not expecting this thing to take a turn, but you noticed when you clicked in probably that there's a mention of private equity entering the field of behavior analysis, and we wound up there, so we included it in here. I think the conversation was so organic and natural, but let me know in the comments, questions, call in afterwards on Anchor. Remember, you can do that. I'll tell you afterwards. So with that said, let's jump into episode 1 of the Controversial Exchange. Oh, and to those of you that are following on in video format, because you're Patreon supporters, thank you. Welcome. Let's go. Now I got a price for y'all. Snake eyes on dice for y'all. Shoulders on ice for y'all. A6 all the hate. I woke in the bar today. Got lost in the bar today.
4, 3, 2, 1. We're live.
We're live-ish. We're not actually.
We're recorded. Dr. Rick Kubina, professor, Penn State, PT master extraordinaire, fellow science fiction comic book nerd, Star Trek fan.
He is charged.
Here to talk about standardization, measurement, behavior analysis, philosophy, world, life, living, and everything else. So thanks for coming, Rick. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to a fruitful conversation with you.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, I do want to say one thing. I met you for the first time 3.5 years ago, and you did your presentation on Chartalytics, and I was still coming into the world of precision teaching, and I had a visceral reaction to it. And, looking back on it, I've done a lot of reflection on it. I think looking back on it, it was that the tenacity that you brought to the table made me feel like I was doing everything in my practice completely wrong. But looking back on it, it was just more like the cognitive dissonance that was coming with the words that you were using and saying, and the way that things were acting out, the way that I was playing out my day and my profession. So I just want you to know that over time, I've really come to appreciate the fact that you're super raw and honest about that kind of stuff. And as I've tried to get into this podcasting thing too, and this is not to kiss your ass, I just really feel like it's important to put this out there because it's the field, man, I feel like there's a lack of authenticity oftentimes when we project these hyper professional, hyper tailored personas into the world, and rather than projecting our honest and sincere opinions about the way we think scholarship should be done, academia should be pursued, debate should be happened, just discourse in general should be engaged in, it really holds us back from getting to the root of the problem and really coming up with good solutions to things. So I think that looking back on some of the things that you've said about measurement and just in general being willing to put it out there like that, I'm really grateful for it, and just wanted to say that to you because I feel like that's not been a thing. That's that. So moving forward, so you're a Penguin, Buckeye, and the rest. I was hoping that maybe we could get started with kind of setting the stage for people on what brings us here to talk about things. So your specialization in precision teaching, I think that a lot of people at this point know what it is, but maybe we could do like the quick 5-minute elevator rundown and then kind of springboard from there. What do you think?
Sure. Do you mean my background or what I'm doing now?
Yeah. Why don't you start with your background briefly, and then we'll jump into PT, and then we'll jump into measurement.
Okay. As you meant, by the way, before I get into that, I remember being in that gym and being delighted by your very thoughtful questions. And when I present, I always appreciate people like you that ask the hard questions, because it means you're trying to reconcile the information with what you have. And that's a very honest way of moving forward. So I can still recall our multiple conversations we had. I started off, as you mentioned, at Youngstown State University, which are the Penguins. And there I had the good fortune to run into a guy named Steve Graff, who turned out to be a big-time precision teacher. He taught me as a naive, ignorant undergrad about the chart, taught me about behavior analysis. There were other professors there that also talked about behavior analysis. It excited me. I was applying it to my life. And when I asked my advisor, hey, where should I go to learn more about behavior analysis and precision teaching? He says, oh, you're going to go to Ohio State. Not knowing anything, I lucked out, went to Ohio State. Cooper was my advisor. He's the one that I asked to study with. Tim Herron, Bill Heward, Diane Sonato, Ralph Gardner. There were just all of these amazing people there. And there were other faculty that were there too that were great. And they instilled in me how important it is to take this science and apply it to help people. It was a special ed program, so I got my degree in special ed. Then I went out and taught for a number of years, acted as a behavior analyst, special ed teacher, and decided, hey, this stuff works so well that I'd like to share this with many people. Went back and worked with Coop again for my doctoral work, and 3 short years after that, I got a job, and my first job was at Clarion. Then I went to Penn State in 2000, and I've been here ever since. So that's my background. And from that whole time, I still, to this day, have that same drive that I did when I was an undergrad. And that is, how do we help change the world, and how do we do it with our behavioral science?
One thing that I've liked about your career path is the additional route you took was working on Chartlytics. Can you tell us a little bit about that real quick?
I would say around 2010, maybe 2009, we were at a point where the information age, and we're all living in the information age. It is at this point where I'm holding my hand up and doing an upward line for those of you that can't see me. It's accelerating. And as we go through these rapid growth periods, many people just would not use the chart because it's too complicated. It takes, when I started off, as I mentioned, with the paper chart, and for 20 years, I would teach people how to use that paper chart. It would take me at least 3 hours, a minimum of 3 hours, to get the very basics down. To get someone up and running, it would take 6 hours. That was with me, who really understood it very well. That's a non-starter for a lot of people. And what about people that don't have access to someone like me or other folks that are out there? There's not a lot of literature. Well, there's literature out there. There's not a lot of books. There's this perfect storm that had come to be that was not in favor of scaling precision teaching. Many people would say, hey, is there an app for that? If you remember that. Which
Yeah.
people still use to this day. And I finally said, you know what, I just got to go all in and help create an app. I mean, there have been Excel templates out there. There have been other people that have tried to create things. So I wanted to do that, and I did do that. And Chartlytics is still going. It's still thriving, I would say, and it's going to continue to grow.
Dig. It's just a atypical route, I think, for some professors to jump into those sort of things. So I applaud that. So yeah, we're going to have information and links down below. People can go check that out if they want to learn more. We'll gather those at the end from you too. The point of today was to jump into standardization. And we can talk about it within measurement. I think that's definitely a good area. But first of all, just the historical significance. I know you write this a lot and you talk about it, just the importance of standardization in science in general. Like we've applied it in other domains, in different areas of science, right? Physics, when it comes to measurement and such. I guess, why is it so hard in behavioral science to start applying those standards?
That is a great question. I have a number of thoughts on it. Standardization, as you point out, is critical in the world. Where we are as a civilization, we have benefited from standards. People they take it for granted how important, or they take it for granted the notion of how standards impact their lives. When you get dressed in the morning or when you go shopping for clothes, there are standard sizes that we have. And if you go, for example, as Dimitri was saying, I will let it be known that I am an active cosplayer, and that means I dress up in crazy outfits and I go to places and I share my geek pride. I will sometimes...
Sidebar real quick. Sorry to interrupt. Sidebar real quick. Did you see Aquaman?
Oh, not yet. It's on my agenda. I did cosplay as Aquaman, so that's something. But I'll order clothes from, like, China is big into cosplaying, so anime's big over there. And when I buy clothes from China, I have to go up 2 sizes because their standards are different from our standards. They're just the way when you buy milk, when you exchange money for services, we have all of these standards. And it makes our lives better because it helps us understand things are consistent. It helps us understand the quantities that we're dealing with. In science, it's just, if you don't have standardization, your field's going to suffer. At one point, we did have more standards than we did now. Dial the time back to when Skinner and his group were making all these discoveries. They used rate, which you put it on this standard visualization, which was called the cumulative recorder, and they discovered all of these things because I could come out to Reno to your lab and I wouldn't have to worry about interpreting what I'm seeing because it's standard, it's standardized. And other sciences, they don't even question that. That's the thing. But we have gotten away from that because we've gotten away from many of the measurement tools that Skinner has given us. And that's creating all of these problems that people don't even know that we have.
So we can go a few different ways here. I don't know if you have any ideas, Dimitri.
Yeah, I was gonna actually that actually is a good place to ask the question when we're talking about something like rate. I think a common criticism of something like when we're looking at just exclusively using rate of response to measure things is that someone might say, is it limiting when you're looking to measure or looking to different areas of human behavior or behavior analysis, like more complex behavior, inner behavior, that kind of thing, like especially with the emergence of the contextual behavior science kind of wing of the field now and that kind of thing. I see that being an ongoing challenge moving forward, and I don't know how I would reconcile that. What is your kind of thoughts on that?
There are a number of what I'll call faux criticisms or faux attacks or whatever you want to call it against precision teaching, and that's one of them. People will say, well, precision teachers say everything has to be rate-based. We use the word frequency, by the way. They mean the same thing, but frequency, I like that term better because that's what they use in the natural sciences. So I'm going to use frequency from here on out. And it's a dimensional measure. And no one that I know says that everybody has to use that dimensional measure. If you need to have duration, use duration. If you want latency, go for latency. So that answering that way kind of cuts off that question in that I don't know people that are saying that. Maybe there are some folks out there, and maybe it seems like that because Lindsley, when he wrote, he championed frequency because Skinner used that very often. Measuring it can be very important, but it doesn't mean it has to be the only measure.
I totally agree with you what you're saying as far as like no one's really advocating for one particular dimension.
But some people might, and that was a good question because that comes out a lot. So it's a good question to ask.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess then let me just ask you then, what would be the context if someone would do that, and why do you think that would be the case? I'm just curious.
Why would people just advocate for that?
Yeah, because that's, I guess let me put it like this. That my initial thing with the PT thing or the PT community was felt that it was a very it was almost like, oh my God, I don't know how to put cult like, it was like,
Sure.
And the commitment and the marriage to the rate of response thing was what turned me off. And then, you clean that up when I first talked to you actually about the different types of dimensions and measures that are available. Now you shouldn't be that way, but I wonder why. Is there a particular reason why in the community that is how it's advocated or anything like that?
I've got an idea. Well, I mean, one thing that I think that's pretty particular out of that, which, man, it'd be cool to have a line of research on this, but you are constantly, as a product of the measurement system of dropping dots continuously, you are looking at behavior in front of you as an intervention and analyst, and then you're looking at it on this chart, and you're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth at a rate that is so much higher, and just literally multiples higher than most analysts are used to. I think our standards are sometimes looking at data every week or two, right? Whereas a precision teacher can look at data every minute, essentially, if they wanted to. And that's just, it creates this connection with the person that you're working with and the phenomenon that you're studying that I really think would be cool to walk out. And I've got a hunch there, that's a byproduct of just your intimacy with the things that you're looking at.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Let me bridge what you both have said because it's important. How would you feel, and I'm saying this to the audience, how would you feel if someone came up to you and said, hey, you're doing things wrong? What reaction would you have? And you would probably say, well, I went through this really great program. My professor said I should do it this way. I read these books and these other people are saying they're doing it. And, all my friends are doing it that way. All my colleagues are doing it that way. If someone said there's a better way to do it, the chances are you're going to be defensive right out of the gate. And we had a precision teaching conference not too long ago, and there was a panel. And one person stood up and said to this panel that was talking about why aren't more people adopting precision teaching, he said, well, why are you all so mean and in telling us this is the only way to do things? And I should have stood up and said something because no one was being mean. Everyone was just saying, here's a better way. But this person was so offended, so attacked by the fact that because they weren't doing this way, they took it as an attack. In that, but it would be like if we were all medical professionals and one of you was putting your head to the chest of someone else, and I said to you, hey, we have a stethoscope. Use this because you can detect those heartbeats better. You might immediately be attacked by that. You might not like it because it's not the way you're doing it. It's not the way everyone else is doing it, even though it's better to have a stethoscope and you'll have more accurate data. So that's what I see that's going on right now in our field. And people will say things to make themselves feel better, like what you said, Dimitri, earlier. Well, those precision teachers, they just want to do everything with rate, or, they say they should always do this. And it's easy to dismiss that group because now you don't have to change personally. And that's a hard pill to swallow, to have spent all this time and all of a sudden for someone to tell you to change your measurement world. And it's that dramatic. So I can appreciate people who are outside that don't have this knowledge. And I don't think that they're wrong because they didn't learn this in graduate school. They don't have the resources. And, just like what Skinner said, the rat's always right, or as what we like to say, the learner's always right. So I get it, and I can feel their pain.
I agree. Well said. I think one point's also mentioned here is there's this excellent article by Embry and Bigland summarizing all of our evidence-based kernels and these minimum units or procedures that are shown to be effective if you take everything else out. And there was some research they summarized. I just pulled it up. There was 6 articles where they were looking at this us versus them mentality that was actually studied empirically. And it's shown to literally increase aggression and violence amongst the groups of each other. Now, I'm not saying that we're throwing bows at each other on these things necessarily, right?
Tribal is very real, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
live it every day, don't
Yeah.
we? Also, it's kind of like wanting to hold on to something, I think, and keep it precious and not really look at it as a way to disseminate it or soften it and not compromise it. You know, a lot of the time when you're looking to disseminate something that does have such a pure following, in order to get it out to a broader audience, you have to, I don't want to use the word water down, but you definitely have to alter it and soften it and or mold it and morph it so that it more fits the needs and nuances that are going on across the board too, to make it a more palatable pill to swallow. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily either side is really ready for that either. You know, I think one thing that I did see that you guys did, Rick, was with the successive timed or successive timings chart. I think that's an attempt to bridge that gap a little bit and not just look at it strictly in terms of, you know, minutes or days or just strict time, but more looking at it in the way that a more conventional behavior analyst would visualize the way that they do their work. Was that, I'd never seen that before. Was that just like an attempt to respond to that? Or was that like a type of chart that's been out there before? Because I'm a little limited in that area.
We have there's standard acceleration charts, which is the daily, the weekly, the monthly, and the yearly. But there are other acceleration charts, which aren't necessarily standard acceleration charts. That would be an example of one of them, and it would be in line with what many behavior analysts are doing right now. It was created to help people do functional analysis, which is very popular. And even before that, there's something called the timings chart, which is a way, behavior analysts are awash in data. That's one of the beautiful things about our field. And how do you collect that data and make, as Ryan was saying earlier, decisions in real time? And that's part of why that was created. I want to say this to your audience. I have learned, and I've taken a different path I'm still a professor, but I'm also the director of research for Central Reach, and I am fully in the tech world. Anyone out there that wants to create $1 million or $1 billion idea, here's what you do. Find something that's a big problem for people and figure out how tech can solve that problem. And that's what we tried to do with Chartlytics. That's what Central Reach is doing as a company, trying to create this product. And there are many other companies. If you go to ABAI, just walk through the hall, and every time you'll see someone new popping up. There's all kinds of companies out there bringing tech to us. So I'm optimistic about the future, and the things that were difficult, if we can use tech to solve that, then we'll have more people using whatever that innovation is.
Yeah, I mean, business has been intertwined with behavior analysis, I feel like, since the beginning, just because of the nature of the way we practice, because it's always kind of like this pyramid structure, right? You know, you graduate your BCBA now or whatever, and now you have, you know, your RBTs now, but at the time, direct care staff that you oversee, and then over time you grow, and then you get another person underneath you, and it becomes this kind of top-down pyramidal thing, but the business intertwined. But do you think the techno know-how that we're lacking, I feel like that takes a certain kind of personality or a certain type of motivation to get there. Does it conflict with the idea of us being helping professionals?
That is a really good question. In fact, I will be on a panel with Mark Dixon, with Matt Sikoria, and with Andy Bondi, and we're going to talk about this very issue. It's a real issue. There's a lot of money. As a matter of fact, I just read an article on LinkedIn where someone was talking about how PE or private equity is flowing into our field like it's never happened in its existence. Brian, I would be surprised if you had been, people have come to you to either buy your services or buy you out or whatever.
Yeah, no, it starts to flow. I can't remember exactly, but I want to say someone was telling me that it was like 4 or 5 times per year increases the last couple of years on just the acquisitions of behavior analysis, um, facilities, programs, services, etc. And when you start to look at that growth rate over the next like 5 years, it's just absurd. It's insane.
Yeah. So what this article was saying is that they're noticing a lot of unethical behavior because of all the money that's coming in. And they cited, someone was just sold for $250 million. There was this other company called Epic. I'm not familiar with them, but I think they had a behavior arm that they had $1 billion exit. I mean, these numbers are unbelievable. So getting back to what you said, how does this influence us? We are entrepreneurial, and many people do have a business. Not everybody, but most of the practitioners, that's what they're doing. And there are issues there to ferret out and to understand how are those dollars going to affect us. But that's probably a issue for a whole nother show.
Oh yeah, no, it definitely is. I think checks. I think the quick answer for folks listening would be like there needs to be a proper system like checks and balances there, both socially within your company and such on like what are you trying to achieve and how's that going and what's the real source of influence here. We know as behavior analysts there's multiple sources of influence. Like we can't deny the fact that money is going to be influencing and driving certain things. It's the degree to which I think is really interesting. I wanted to mention the precision teaching as a field, I would say has large and like as a service model has largely survived because of folks like Ogden Lindsley and others saying go private, go private. I think that's pretty common or it's very commonly referenced that was what helped kind of the 80s to the now and for precision teachers.
Is that exodus of people back when that were more closely tied to Ogden maybe influenced the fact that PT is, I don't want to say struggled, but I mean not gotten the more popular notoriety and like acceptance in academia or in programs? Is that a piece of it, you think?
Dimitri, I think you just hit the nail on the head, and that's part of what I have concluded. Og and his group of folks really were turned off by the academy. They had this super powerful method, couldn't get people to adopt it, had people always complaining about the chart. There were real professional infighting that was going on there. And because he was such a strong voice, and because you look at the people who went private, look at Morningside, they are a beacon of what you can do with this technology. They have some of the toughest kids and they create just stellar outcomes that people can't even fathom. People are always going there, but they've been private. And Kent he's a big name, but he's been in that industry for quite some time. And other folks too have followed along. And now we're at a phase where there are very few professors like myself. I have some colleagues and some former students of mine, but even folks that, and I'm not going to mention names, that used to be part of the precision teaching are no longer even doing it as they've moved up in certain academic positions. So yes, that has created that influence where precision teaching is. And because you had many people not publishing, not getting grants, not writing books, there's that body of work that's just lacking.
Yeah, the body of work, I think that it's just, we're so conditioned in our programs in what we do to look for and seek what's in JABA or JAB or behavior analysis practice, like the very specific mainstream journals that are tied to what we do, that if it's not present, out of sight, out of mind, right? That's just human nature. If you don't think about it, if you don't come in contact with it, you're not going to touch it. And
right.
If it's not encouraged for you to do it during your quote unquote formative years of developing your professional identity, because graduate school is developing your professional identity. That's really what it is, at least the initial stages of it. And if it's not there, again, identity is it's a pretty intimate, close-knit thing. And like you mentioned before, and as I was mentioning earlier in the podcast, which is why I wanted to say that out of the gate, was that when I first had a conversation with you, just the words that you were using, I mean, I had a visceral reaction. And I was like, no, I get punched in the face every day. Whatever, Rick. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. Like, I want to hear you. I want to have this conversation with you, and I thought that it was a really, I think that as we go through that and as we keep continuing to expand the field, and I think because if we get like access to technology that simplifies it, because another thing with the chart is while on the one hand, I don't disagree that it's not hard to learn out of the gate. Initially, it is an intimidating thing to look at if you don't know what the hell you're looking at. I mean, that's just the facts. You look at this giant blue thing and you're like, whoa, there's a lot of lines, a lot of numbers, a lot of angles, a lot of this, a lot of that, multipliers. And I mean, again, not to like pigeonhole people, but I mean, the reality is the general kind of person who goes into our field usually is not a mathematical analytical type from that angle. They're analytical in terms of looking at human behavior and learning condition of functional relations in the environment, but not necessarily from a mathematical perspective, right? Not in a graphical point of view. That's more secondary necessity than it is a primary goal or purpose or outcome of how they see their practice will come into, what they do. So I think that's also like a reversal perception too. I think PTers look at the chart and look at the data as their ultimate goal because they look at themselves as primarily practitioner scientists. And I think interventionists or more conventional behavior analysts look at the entire holistic treatment process as their craft. And the data is just there to inform it. It's not there to drive it necessarily.
I agree with what you're saying. We have, when it gets down to it, for those of you out there who haven't read Johnson and Pennypacker's work, you need to read it at some point. And they point out very early on in their one book that science is all about human behavior. As humans, we are susceptible to all of the things that we know about in behavior analysis and the things we don't know about. We have tribalism in our own field. I have had these conversations where, are you doing CABIS? Are you doing RFT? Or are you doing VB? And whether those are real tribes or not, people identify with that. And if you come at them and be like, well, I'm doing RFT, they're like, oh, that stuff's weird. They don't even understand it, but it's not what they do. And if we are true scientists, we should never be intimidated by things we don't know. We should be objective. We should look at the data. And then we're never really wrong because in science, information is always tentative and you're always looking for the next thing. And you have to be comfortable with not looking at the world as black and white, but many shades of gray. And that's why I love science and I love that part of our field. We are a science, and if we can remember that, we're going to flourish, we're going to grow, and these issues that we're talking about right now won't be problems because we won't have these barriers that we're dealing with right now.
That actually is a great springboard back to us talking about standardization. One of the articles that we were looking to reference in this was this Hayes article. I had never thought about criticizing standardization in a scientific practice or even thinking that maybe it's not always optimal until I read that. And the only thing that I can think of is that and this is just from my own experience now being back in graduate school over again at this level, is that the experimental or explorational research is challenging when you start developing too stringent, too structured, too many rigid guidelines on how to go about certain things. What is your kind of thought on the idea of like, is there limitations to how you standardize things, or is there kind of a middle ground there, or when you hear that idea or that criticism, what's your kind of response to that? What do you think about it?
I'd like to know exactly. I don't know the arguments that you're referencing.
Hold on, I can jump in with those real quick, or at least a quick summary. So it was 1980. I've got it here. Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, called The Technical Drift of Applied Behavior Analysis. Hayes, Rincover, and Solnick. And basically the idea was they looked at I believe it was the first 10 volumes of Java to look at some different measures of how we were doing, kind of living to our core 1968 article by Bear, Wolf, and Risley on some current dimensions, and they looked specifically at applied analytic, general, and conceptual, and they were curious like what's going on. And there's a few different measures. And it's a fantastic, like amazing article, but essentially they're looking at how we were starting to get away from like this, and I guess in my words, an understanding of it, getting away from looking at, those true applied settings, things that were socially significant. And our research was about not like an analog setting, right? Like it wasn't a research study in some analog, controlled setting, but it was something that was socially significant to that person that we were looking at helping. There was a clear drift and what they mean by drift is there was a decrease in the number of publications that were coming out that were applied in nature. And what it was is we were starting to kind of form these standards and these things that we were interested in looking at. And I mean, we've seen this in other places, but I think what Dimitri's getting at there is like we start to create these standards to some extent, which can be extremely useful for us. But then we get these kind of cultural practices, right? We're kind of reinforced to engage in certain types of in this case publications, and it comes
it's like, well then at one point, is there such thing as going too far, or am I asking a cultural question and not an actual scientific one?
Yeah.
And maybe those are two different things. But
now that you mentioned that article, I read that last when I was a graduate student, and before you mentioning it, I couldn't even remember what it was about. But now that you said that, that is a very good article, which hopefully your readers will read. There's a lot of great points in it. I'd say this about standards. Just because you have a standard doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Gangs have standards. One of the standards for gangs is you get beat in to the gang. I don't like that practice. I'm not going to join a gang. So we have all kinds of standards. But is that standard useful? How does that standard help move the field, move your individual practice? If I told you right now, I can give you a standard for social validity, what do you think about that?
Yeah, people would eat that up, man.
Yeah, and we could have that if people would only break some of these measurement practices. That's the thing with precision teaching, not just precision teaching. I'm going to talk about the chart here. Forget precision teaching. Just looking at this standard chart, we can 10 to 100x our elevation of our measurement practices. Our field is under attack by statisticians. And if any of you want those articles, just type in single case design statistics or something like that, and you will uncover a whole host of articles where people are saying, hey, you're not standard, you don't have any numbers. That's because everyone uses this non-standard linear graph. They make it up themselves. They don't quantify anything. And as a result, they don't have any numbers. They just are left with their own subjective opinion. Is this thing rapidly increasing? I mean, it's so crude of a measure.
To paint a picture for folks, like my program that I say is going well, right, or going good, or if say I have a data trend that I'm trying to increase, those words are so loosey-goosey, right? Like mine is different than Dimitri's, different than yours. And that, I think, in a way is absurd. In a sense, we're ineffectively communicating with ourselves, and then anything that we put out there, if we say an intervention is, we can't actually say the value of an intervention, if you like. Does that make sense? Like I can't even communicate to people like what our true value is because there are no standards, not even in the sense of what to measure, but what to expect because we don't even have our measurement figured out. Is that fair
I think
to
what
say?
you're talking about is precision in language though too, right?
Yeah, but the interesting thing about the chart is that the precision in language comes as a part of the chart. Like the fact that you can start to quantify trends with acceleration and talk about those in numbers, like Rick's saying, allows you then to be much more precise in your language. I could pass by a precision teacher and ask really quick, like, how's a program going? And they could say, oh, it's on a ×2. I know it's a standard that should be seen in Precision Teaching Center. I know that means that there's a doubling in that thing per week. And I know at some point, depending on what the specific areas that they're teaching, that there's a terminal rate. So I can quickly quantify the probability of when that is going to be mastered. I can communicate that to people with just more certainty, not perfectly, but But I mean, when you think about how well we can do that as precision teachers or as a community without computers, right? It's absurd and it's so cool. Much less when you start to apply computers to these sort of things in the long run, like the precision, the implications of using this precision could literally alter the face of the world if you did things in the right way.
So I'm just going to ask the weird off the wall question here. Is it possible that there's so much drama and so much emotion tied to the chart at this point that maybe it's ripe for a reset on a little bit of a different standard version that might be more acceptable to everyone at once? Like, is there a compromise that could occur, or like something that would be fresh that no one's married to?
We
Like,
change the color and
I don't know, or like even have zero. I mean, which I know, Rick, you have a whole thing on zero, but like that's one thing that I'm still kind of like not totally with you on. Being able to demark, or at least to note when there's a non-occurrence, even though obviously non-occurrence is not behavior, but more like denoting in time the absence of something in the passage of time, right? So being able to somehow have that in that way. I don't know. I just feel like that there's certain ways that we conceptualize the world in such a way where like we have to have those demarcations on our visual analyses or visual displays too, right? And that is one limitation, that just thinking about it for the way that I think about the world and the way that I see it, it would require so much nuanced conditioning and changing across the board, even for myself, that I can see why from a cultural point of view, and I mean behavior and analytic culture, that would be a massive challenge for actually achieving this goal or this end of standardizing the way that we use visual displays.
Sure. So you bring up an interesting point. Should we change somehow this tool because the consumer base isn't happy with it? Does the consumer base have so much power that we should reconceptualize this tool because they're not going to like it? Let me take you back to a time in medicine where many people were dying because they didn't want to wash their hands. This is the same thing. The people that argued for, and I can't remember the guy's name, that was the person who had the data and showed definitively, if you wash your hands, the number of children that survive, the mothers that survive, goes up. And if you don't wash your hands and you get infection, and they didn't really know these concepts then, even so that was the case, because everyone else was doing it this other way, they just absolutely refused to wash their hands. And in history, in the end, was down of
Semmelweis.
Thank you. Exactly. So here's the point that I make. Just because the consumer base may not like what's there has no bearing whatsoever on the effects of what that tool can give you. I was in a debate one time, and I did this a few years ago, where I would try to debate anybody just to get people listening to this. And still, I'll come, like your podcast, you all see that this is an important issue. And I'm just going to keep writing about this. And the more people that see the evidence, that's the way you win people's hearts and minds. But, we're not there yet. And the point that I made in this debate, someone asked the question, the question was, should we use standard acceleration charts or should we use linear graphs? And the one person said, well, I like to use linear graphs because parents can understand them and they'll never understand that chart. And my response to them was, well, what's more important, that the consumer's happy or that you as a professional can bring this powerful information to change that person's behavior? And you tell me, I'll give you all of you have that choice. Would you rather have this parent understand this tool that's going to handcuff you, that could lead you down the wrong? Not only can it handcuff you, it actually can give you the wrong information if you create it in the wrong way. It distorts information. This isn't my opinion. This is factually true. So I get impassioned about this because I know the majority of people in our field are using these charts, which are most likely going to be made incorrectly. I've done the research on that, and it's almost 90% of people are making their linear graphs incorrectly. And as a result, they're making compromised decisions. I don't have the evidence on how dramatic that effect is, but it would be dramatic. If you have a line that's going up in a 90-degree angle, and because of your manipulation, all of a sudden it goes down to a 45-degree angle, or the opposite, you tell me, do you think people are going to make different decisions? So these are the issues that our field must grapple with. And I want these things to change now. And if you don't like what I'm saying, then you come up with some evidence that's counter to what I'm saying. Go ahead and give that evidence.
I think you beg the question though, and I think you point out what your example and your analogy kind of points out though is that the comparison to a medical professional or doctor, I mean, it's really a question of competency in our field, right? It's that it makes you ask the question, well, let's just hypothetically say you are that person sitting across from that family or that person, and they ask you these questions. Are you really competent enough to stand on your own without this unnuanced graph that you're describing, right? Like, I'm not sure if the degree of competency is out there to be able to do that, to engage in the explanations and to get the buy-in and to get the trust to be able to practice in that way. I think that's the barrier underpinning that kind of, I don't know, conflicts with that idea. There's a major competency problem.
I wonder how much this change in private equity coming in is going to start really putting things to the test, because people seem to be a lot more serious sometimes when it comes to their money than the social outcomes. I'm not saying people in our field, some people in general. Yeah, in a sense, like that private equity is going to be a phase change in the culture of our field, right? And I'm curious if that is going to start to increase the scrutiny because of just the conditions of capitalism. Like, will we start to see people wanting to predict behavior more accurately? Like, if we are, as a field, looking at things and 90% of us are looking in ways that could compromise the decisions that we're trying to make, that shows you a few, makes me think of so many things. Like, who's doing that? How much have they been acquired for? How much, what are the data and their outcomes actually there? I know someone in this field that's looking at, certification of organizations and like the practices that they're employing. And there's people that are known in our field that are producing outcomes that are negative. They're not actually helping people at the end of the day. And these are the folks that are getting offered to be bought up. So there's a whole different wave, I think, that's going to be happening that could positively influence this field in the sense of us taking our measurement much more precisely and seriously. But it's definitely going to be at the detriment of folks. I don't know, that information age, and our field's always behind, I feel like 10 or 15 years. Like, we've seen other industries totally transform. Ours is approaching that, I think, heavily and specifically in measurement. I'd like to hope, and I feel.
I will say this, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I'll say it now. I don't feel private equity coming to the field is bad at all. Let's face it. If you went to a university, guess what? That university now is most likely run like a corporation. I teach at Penn State University, and if you don't think dollars matter at a place like Penn State or any place, Big Ten, Pac-10, Harvard, you give me whatever institution you want, even small community colleges. Those places go out of business and they're no longer around. Money is incredibly important. It's important in our society. So there's no one that's immune to it. And the fact that people have recognized that behavior analysis has this value and they want a piece of the pie should be celebrated, because now outside sources are seeing that we have something that's very powerful. I'm old enough now, and it's weird being in the field for as long as I have, because I can still remember being that young undergrad, but I had been in the field long enough now where we've assumed that second-class citizen. When I was in my doctoral program, I started in 96, I graduated in 99, so this isn't that long ago, maybe a little more than 20 years. The history of psychology professor proudly proclaimed that behavior analysis was this dead science. Well, guess where we are now, Professor? We are growing. We are in the driver's seat because we have something that is good. And I can only think that this will open up new opportunities to us and allow us to do things that we haven't done in the past. The group that had, in full disclosure, Chartlytics was acquired. In the group that acquired us, when you look at private equity companies, Their goal is to make money. That's what they exist for. And that's okay. We live in this weird time where some people look at lots of money as bad. And I'm not going to go into those different arguments. This isn't a question of capitalism versus socialism. And I'm not going to go there. But we are in a capitalistic society, and we do need to make money for businesses to survive. And this company that has acquired, you get different kinds of private equity firms. This company wants to do things right. They're investing in people. They are investing in the technology. And what you're going to see is this incredible product. I am on the inside now of Central Reach, and I can see what's happening. And I'm just blown away by all these professionals that aren't necessarily they're not behavior analysts. There are behavior analysts in the company, but they're these incredibly smart business people, and they see these value propositions and they want to do right and make this company grow, because the value that you're exchanging for money is people's lives getting better. And doctors in the whole medical profession is set up on that particular basis, that the value you get is you're healthy for the exchange of your resources, your money, your capital. It's the same thing with behavior analysis. So money's not bad. It can be bad if people are greedy and doing things unethically, but the general premise is what I'm trying to share with you is that these dollars coming in, I don't feel are bad.
Yeah, I cannot wait to fast forward like 5 or 10 years and like re-listen on a conversation like this and see where the progression of the field goes, because there's like, in a sense, in some ways, like this perfect storm too going on where like we had the flight Farewell My Lovely, Skinner talking about, us getting away from rate of measurement in like 1974, I believe. and then we have the technological drift article that we talked a little bit. We have we know in 2008 that Embry-Bigwin article of like, what are our evidence-based kernels? What are the things that we know work? And I can guarantee you so many behavior analysts are going to be like, what is that article? I want to go look that up and learn about that. Like, these are things that our own field figured out, we talk about, but we don't actually employ and use. So not like this, talking about the acquisition rate and the private equity coming in, man, if I was some of those folks listening also, like we might be saying as a field that we can do things that we actually don't even know how to do, or we don't even follow the best practices of our own damn field, which is just leaving this next 5 or 10 years is going to be like some of the most interesting, I think, for us being in the public light. Like, I feel like it could go perfectly in that we have some really good light shed upon our field. But in the other sense, you could have somebody that, might happen to be acquired. It might be huge and it might be this big thing. And all of a sudden you learn that like the best practices weren't necessarily being employed. And like that will be, I think you have a bigger megaphone as you have more money involved as well.
Whose responsibility is it to set these standards though? So, I mean, so like when we start having these conversations about, private equity versus the academy versus practitioners versus the board even, right? And we're talking about standardization, it makes you want to ask yourself, well, who is the right person, group, entity? What are the consequences that will select these standards, right? Well,
I mean, the interesting thing in the private equity space is like whoever's adding the most value and solving the problems at the end of the day. And you can only fake that for so long without the consumer base actually finding it out. Like, you see consumer bases turn so quickly if that value is not there. So if we're saying that our value proposition is that we're going to make human lives better, then it's going to come down to who's making people's lives best. How are they doing those sort of things?
But that kind of begs the translational versus basic research question though, right? Like sometimes you just do R&D, like you have to. Science sometimes produces things that don't have intrinsic usefulness out of the gate, right? The discovery of the atom was pointless at the time, but it led to the atom bomb, right? So I mean, well, who will pay for that if it's just finances that are determining, what's valuable, what's not, and who's best or who's good or who sets the standard?
I mean,
future? Like how do we in the field, if we're talking about from the scientific point?
I would say behavior analysis likes to think that in general that these standards are set by certain bodies, certain people in the field, and certain journals and practices and such. But I mean, the reality is that it's altering when you start to have other options available for setting those things, and it becomes in a sense like the megaphone. Like you can see, we live in a day and age where if you say something loud enough, it starts to be listened to by a lot of people and believed. Now, if you start doing that on your own and you're doing it with sound science, like you could totally alter the game. So a good historical person, I may or may not keep this in here, but a good historical person was Francis Meckner. Most folks don't know him as like the limelight and being out there. He created this thing called Meckner notation. He has self-funded his own research for like 50 years. He created the technology that went into closed captioning, like something that altered and was in every single person's electronic device, TV, and all that sort of broadcast technology. And none of it came from him working that sort of stuff through a journal. Like there's been these alternative approaches. And I'm personally stoked for private equity because it allows someone like a Chartlytics to start to just like have their entire research and development lab, right? We've seen that with Morningside Academy. They've always talked about themselves being a laboratory school, right? And said these sort of things. So I don't know. I'll step back for a sec. That's my thoughts that may be relevant.
Private equity is coming in on the applied side. That has no bearing on the basic side. People will still be able to work in their labs, and there are mechanisms for funding that those people can apply to. That's not going to change, and private equity doesn't have anything to do with the folks. If anything, if you might find some private equity that is discovering, that may end up funding labs. So it may actually bleed down to those folks. It's not now because we're in that time where people are recognizing what we're doing, but who knows what the future holds along there. I'm an optimist, so I don't think it's going to be bad at all.
Did we answer your question at all?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. For me, it's just more like I think of the ethics of the idea. Like I like to think of myself, like when I think about science, it's like it's the last vestige of philosophical purity, I guess, like pursuit of truth above all, right? But then on the flip side, of course, in the world that we live in, you have to rely on the financial piece of it. But we know that money is a corrupting influence on any endeavor that it has. I mean, not 100% or completely. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that it is a completely, but it does have a tendency to do that.
We see professors chase literature lines because of partially due to the fact that they keep getting larger grants in those areas within and outside of our field. Like without a doubt, like I'm sure some of the best ones are still passionate in that area and they want to explore it. But yeah, I don't know. It's not really changed, I guess.
And, I don't want to be naive, but let's look at an analogy. Look at big pharma and look at, is there any unethical things that go on there in terms of money and people doing research? You listen to NPR where someone's like, oh, this person was in the pocket of this pharmaceutical company and the research happened to show X. Well, that wasn't the case at all. If we ended up in a situation like that, could that be possible? Yes, people could be corrupted by a huge dollar sum. So we can't be naive and think that possibility isn't out there, but it's hard to...
On a fun flip side of this, I want to go a little more like sci-fi dystopian here. It also kind of opens up the field to being used for the dark side of the force a little bit too, like to the max. Like if
Sure.
I mean, you think about something like Facebook or social media in general, and like how Amazon tracks big data pretty much in general. I mean, big data is pretty much not behavior analysts using statistical models to predict human choice making, which is behavior analytical, right?
Yeah, there's some behavior analysts in Facebook and such. If you start to dig around, there's people that have been playing in those areas, man. We have a history. Our field has a history of working and consulting with the CIA.
And look, when Skinner came out in the 70s with Beyond Freedom and Dignity and About Behaviorism, he was on a cover. I can't remember which cover it was, but
Times, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it was Time, and he was like the most dangerous man because of what psychology could do. No, so what you're saying is not new. It's been out there. Now we're just to the point where we can realize this at scale. I know people that have apps that apply behavior analytic concepts such as response costs that work stunningly well. Response costs wouldn't be something that anybody in the audience that has a basic level of understanding would be surprised by. But when you can apply that to someone's phone and you can set it up, you're getting behavior change.
Yeah. I can just hear people like, what? This is a standard thing that's being implemented without positive practices first? Surprise. It's how the world works. I think if you're struggling with that, what you do is you go out there and you figure out how to create those things. Like that is your next step. If you're really worried about that, like no one else is going to stop. You have to go out there and put those things out there.
I was saying, like, just a good example is the iPhone has a lot of new self-management features where you can limit your amount of social media time. You can limit, your daytime waking hours when you receive calls, et cetera, and it automates it for you so you don't even realize it. But it's basically your cybernetic device is controlling your life, even though it's not connected or attached to your body.
Yeah. And we are going to be in a position as a field that we can either take some kind of high road that is not in our best interest, or we can embrace where technology is going. Let me give you an example. That iPhone or Android or whatever you use, people have all these concerns about privacy, but as long as you have that and you're going places, someone knows where you are all the time. Someone knows what you're looking at all the time. And think about people's health. You could, with the sensors that are coming on board, if I'm going to hold up my iWatch here, the new iWatch, this is an iWatch 3, they have an iWatch 4 that's out. It's so sophisticated that people's insurance premiums may be tied to wearing devices and to how much activity they get and so on and so forth. Do we want to be part of that narrative, or do we want to give it up and let some people in the cognitive sciences, and I'll use air quotes with cognitive sciences.
What I was going to say is that, so I guess bringing this back around when we're talking about how all these non sequiturs we've been on, how they relate to the idea of standardization. Like I agree that if we're not going to do it, someone else should. So, I mean, we're the most benevolent science and the most substantive one, in my opinion, when it comes to from a psychological perspective. What do we do? What does the future say? Do we just lean in and go full tilt? Do we proceed with caution? What's kind of your hope for the future?
You asked the question earlier, which I didn't respond to, and that is, who sets these standards? And the answer is we do. Why aren't more people using the chart? Because no one has demanded it. Why aren't more people concerned about errors in the graphs that they make? Because nobody is concerned about that. No one sees that that's a problem. As a field, we are a bunch of people that will come together for whatever reason, and we will govern our own destiny. We can make good decisions, we can make bad decisions, or poor decisions. And by those decisions, they will impact people. They will impact the way people practice. You talk to people about the board, the behavior analytics certification board, and you will get, you just bring that up at a conference, and you'll get people riled up talking about different issues. But the substance of the board and what they're trying to do is good.
Yeah,
they're trying to bring this field together, provide some basic level of competency. Now, I get the question all the time. What do you think about them kicking off the chart? I mean, I get that all the time. Because obviously,
I mean, it's a product of the ways in which they sample and set those.
That's right. And so that's where it is. But even though they're a growing organization, no organization is perfect. And across time, all we can do in science and in organizations is learn from our mistakes and keep on striving to be better. There are a number of people that I follow in the world, outside of behavior analysis, that talk about abundance. For many people that watch the news, 90% of it is going to be negative because people realize, how do you capture eyeballs? You share things that are scary and frightening. I hate watching the news because I'm always getting negative things. You would think that the world's going to end based off of the news cycle. But having a mindset of abundance and positivity and how can we do well in the future, that will serve us well. And if we look for the positive things and don't dwell on mistakes or things, even if you see something that's not well with the world, how can we change it? We are behavior analysts. Our expertise is changing behavior. And no one said it's easy, but that doesn't mean we can't try. And while it may be daunting, if we don't try, if we're not in the game, if we're not always striving to use the best tools and to continually improve, then we are going to sign the death warrant of our science. It will become stagnant, it will become fractured, or it will just not be as powerful as something else. If I were going to leave everyone with some positive thoughts, it's just that we have come a very long way, and now we are in this place that's super exciting. We are living through the information age. All of these new things are going to be coming on board. And if you are young, and even if you're not young, you have the opportunity, like me. I am just turned 52 this past December. And look at me. I'm in a part of a tech company with all these cool people. I'm learning so much more. And the things that I learned from these other professionals is expanding my understanding of the world and helping me become a better behavior analyst. And there are all these opportunities that, yes, if you want to work with students with a disability, that's going to be there for you. But like you two, I am admirers of what you do. You're out there spreading the word through social media. You are traveling. You're talking to great people. You're bringing these issues up. There can be more than just you. There can be other people. There are more podcasts coming online. There are more books. There's all these things, because as our field grows and more people come, and don't even think about our field. What if we had, there are 32,000 behavior analysts. What if there were 90,000? What if there were 120,000? What if we were the #1 way of doing things in the United States, in the world? How many people do we need to make that happen? So there are lots of opportunities for people out there, and I'm super positive about where we're going. And even though there are places where we can improve, we're a young science. Let's roll our sleeves up. Let's keep talking to one another, and let's be positive and make changes happen.
Shout out to anybody that can give me the year that that's likely to happen, that 90,000 behavior analysts. May or might not have some cards up our sleeves, right?
That's right.
Got me jacked up, Rick. Woo! That was awesome.
So let's kind of summarize these a little bit for folks. I had some points here of like, where does this leave us? Let's take different viewpoints. Like, let's say that you are all about standards. If you're dogmatic, taking that to the point where it is causing problems and not delivering a value at the end of the day, like, I think we can all agree that's too far, right? But the point here is that a standard that does, I would say, like an example of standard acceleration chart, like it does limit the number of things that you may be doing incorrectly. Like, that is the point here we're trying to communicate, is that there could be value to these standards way beyond what we even realize. And at that point, what it does is, in my perspective, it just lets you get to the cool parts of our field faster, right? Like, I can affect outcomes. I can understand data a lot quicker.
I think also the idea of compromise too, honestly. Like, standards are about developing a route and a trajectory for the field, and then having the tenacity and the will to stand by them too. Like, excessive compromise is actually problematic, and that also requires an onus on us as people participating in the field. If we have the audacity to call ourselves behavior analysts, we have to have the work ethic to make sure that we are experts enough in our subject matter to be able to speak to those standards and speak to that high level of technical prowess that's necessary to do what we do. So I think there's a sense of personal responsibility in that too for every practitioner out there who wants to make that difference as well. That's a big piece of it.
If people take one thing away from this, is that standards can improve a science. If they can agree to that and start looking around and say, well, where could standards help improve our lives, they'll naturally come to the conclusion that we need a standard graph. If you don't like the standard acceleration chart, fine. Tell me the standard graph that we should use, because if you think it's a good idea having 32,000 people create their own, everyone has their own different, then right out of the gate.
Can you imagine if doctors did that with EKGs?
It would never happen. But yet do that all the time, and that's a problem. How big of a problem it is, we don't know, because no one has done the research on that to show what kind of decision. Sometimes it probably isn't a big deal. Like, for example, here's a real technical thing. When you have your line graph, your tick marks are supposed to be facing out. They're not supposed to be facing in. How much of a problem, if your tick marks are facing in, is that going to be on your, probably not much, but it is a standard. Whereas if you stretch out the axes and you change from a 45 degree to a 90 degree, you move from something moderately increasing to greatly increasing. That could have an impact. We don't have that data, but that's something that should be on everyone's radar. And the reason why I'm attracted to the chart and why I use it is because it's a standard display and it helps me do my job as a behavior analyst better.
Yeah.
So a couple of final, just like funsy questions. What if you are a young, budding, up and coming behavior analyst and they're coming to, Obi-Wan Kubina? What is your, where are you going to tell them to go start looking to research? What is your suggestion? Where do they need to start? What do they think? What's a big gap or interest area that you think they need to touch?
I would probably open up Java and say, these are not the graphs you're looking for.
Love that.
No, just joking there. It's a little Java joke. Great journal. Love all the people that publish in it. But they do have many graphs that violate the standards. I would say you all you have a unique role, and that is you're sharing this knowledge to people in a very different way. And if people are listening to podcasts, that's a great way to get started. Go on other social media channels. In Facebook, there's the Standard Acceleration Society, which now has well over I don't even know how many. It's one.
I think there's 1,600 people on that page. Is that what you're talking about?
Drop in there, or go to a conference where there are many people. That the International Precision Teaching Conference last year in Seattle had its biggest number ever, because in many of those people were students who were excited about where this is going. And there are more books that are coming out. Shameless plug, I'm dropping a new book this month.
Stoked. You got a date on that?
It'll be before January 30th.
Okay, nice. Very cool.
And there's just many other resources that are out there. Ryan, you referenced articles. There are many articles on precision teaching. I hope I didn't give people the impression that although Ogden and his folks took that route of being private, it doesn't mean there aren't, Kent Johnson has published a couple books, maybe more than that. He's written articles, and there are many other people in the field that do have published research that you can look in. There used to be a journal of precision teaching, but outside of that journal, there are many articles that are in mainstream journals that you can look up. There is a rich trove of information out there. Going to people, the quick way is to jump on some social media channels, listen to podcasts such as this, go to Facebook, jump on Twitter, look up some hashtags, go to LinkedIn. There's a lot of things you all could be doing. I'm not part of Instagram, so I don't know if there's a presence there for charting or not. But
not really. But there's a few channels. Oh.
Marvel or DC?
Oh, that is a tough one. I cannot go. Oh boy. I grew up with both in the 70s, and I have favorite characters in both, but now I've been in that universe. There are a number of other publishers. Image is a big publisher, and there are some very moving pieces and characters in there. So that's really a screwball you threw me. I'm going to give a politician's answer and say both.
No. That's your answer. Fine.
Where do you lie, Dimitri? So the listeners know. Where do you lie on that?
I'm probably more of a DC guy, but I grew up a Marvel guy. I like the archetypes in DC now as an adult. I like reading that more as a grown-up than I do like reading Marvel.
Things are always contextual.
I know, right?
Isn't that the truth?
I have the Green Lantern symbol on my wedding ring.
That it does. I wanted to just pause really quickly before we finish one last little bit with Rick there to remind everybody that the app Anchor, it's anchor.fm/the controversial exchange. You can search and find us. You can call in and we can reply to you. So Dimitri and I will be taking calls on that for the next week after this is up and hosted. So feel free to give us a call. Say what's up. If you want to put in parentheses and say private, we will not air it, but we can actually share it with people that are listening on that app as well. So we invite you to do that. Please consider doing it. Now, one last little bit with Rick, and then you get your post roll. I hope you had an amazing time. And everybody that is on the Patreon viewing this in a video format, thank you for your help. Again, afterwards, you can see where it is that you can go support and be a patron and get that video stream if that's something that you're interested in. If not, that's cool too.
It can never just be one person. You need to have a group of people contributing to this great thing. And what you're doing now, Ryan, I know this is true. You have taken on this rock star status. You have these, all these people that really look up to you because of the things that you're doing. And the more you put yourselves out there, you're taking a risk in publicly saying the things that you do. You don't know if the audience is going to like it, but you're out there and you're taking chances and you are giving people something to think about. And even being controversial is good too, because that can come with its own slings and arrows. So I admire what you all are doing, and I'm just pleased that you're doing it.
I appreciate that, man. Appreciate the kind words. The funny thing is, like, right before we recorded on this, before you hopped in, Dimitri's like, so is there like anything about Rick? And I was like, this guy has always replied to like every email I've sent. He's always taken the time. He always showed up. And that is something where part of it is like, asking and trying to make sure that we're always prepared. Like, you just come in and talk to us a little bit about precision teaching and such. I remember when you signed my book, it's here somewhere. I've got my precision teaching book signed by you. And like, I guess my 2 points are like, I felt like you're the rock star. You are a rock star. And I think the lesson for everybody else there too is we all have a stake in making this field what it is. So don't think that that's necessarily what people are in it for, right? It's just a product of the mediums. And like, how do we all work together to put it in the right light? So having you on has been like fantastic. Thank you so much for jumping on. It's awesome, man. I get goosebumps hanging out with people like yourself. Like, it's great, man. All right, please, wherever you found this, make sure that you go in, comment, tell us how you liked it. Make sure you answer the questions that we left there. And tell a friend, please tag, share. It is the way that we can start to break through the barriers and share what behavior analysis has to offer and have these more meaningful conversations in a public sphere. Remember, also, you can go to anchor.fm/the controversial exchange and call in and leave your thoughts there as well, again, privately, where we will be choosing some of our favorites to air on the Anchor app. Now, our next episode is with Rick Kubina. It airs this coming week, so make sure that you tune back in. It is on standardization and private equity and applied behavior analysis. That is that money that seems to be flooding in, those private investors. We have a conversation around this for about an hour and a half. Now, I have a quick fun fact for you. That is, did you know that 1 in 1,300 people, that's right, in 2018, 1 in 1,300 people that actually tuned into the content chose to support or help out? So I mentioned Patreon before this. Patreon.com/the Daily BA is a values-based system that I set up to where if you're enjoying this, you can go in, you can support for as little as $1 a month, and you get some sort of exchange as well. So Some people receive this in a video series where you can watch online, see us talking back and forth. Other cool things include tiers like the Daily BA, the closed Facebook group where I share other ideas, resources, things like that. Occasionally I get courses, giveaways to hand out to people. We get discount codes that I share with you. I make that super easy to where you can snag some cheaper rates to big events in behavior analysis. And I've paired up with an amazing artist named Lester who makes these just great, phenomenal, really dope posters of legends in our field that we put out there as well. And you can snag some of those depending on your tier. And occasionally I bring on sponsors through this. I make sure that I communicate that with you. And note sponsors, it's only if we truly align on our value system. So that's our show. There are currently over 94 people in the Daily BA Patreon closed group that's accessing these sort of things. I'd love for you to join, so really consider going and checking it out. As a gift for signing up, you get access to all the streams from last year of what we actually produce behind the scenes. You can catch Dimitri and I on Twitter at The Controversial X, that's Controversial EX, or on Instagram at The Controversial Exchange. We will be manning these. We will be answering questions and replying and sharing. So that's how you can reach us in between episodes, in addition to Anchor. And to thank you so much to our listeners. You are the reason that we get to do this. The people on Patreon help us support and make it financially possible, but everybody following, liking, and sharing, you all are helping in this grand vision. So thank you. And I have one last thing that I need to read to you, just so that we're all kosher and we're on the same page. And that is, the views expressed during the Controversial Exchange podcast series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Assumptions made in the analysis are not reflective of the position of any other entity other than the authors, and since we are critically thinking human beings, these views are always subject to change, revision, and rethinking at any time. Please do not hold us to them in perpetuity. This podcast series is to educate and inform, provide discussion, and does not constitute professional advice. That's your Controversial Exchange.